What happens when a regime stops looking for stability and starts preparing for survival at any cost? In this tense and revealing moment, General Jack Keane warns that Iran may be entering a far more dangerous phase, where the most radical forces inside the IRGC are no longer reacting to events, but taking control of them. On the surface, there is still talk of pressure, diplomacy, and strategic choices. But underneath that, a darker reality is forming. Power is shifting, hardliners are rising, and the path ahead may not lead to compromise at all. If Keane is right, then this is not the end of a crisis. It is the opening chapter of something far more explosive.
All right, according to reports, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard is now consolidating power inside of Iran. In other words, the hardline radicals who have terrorized the world for decades are likely running the show. The guys with guns, not the guys in the suits that'll be in Pakistan. Here with more, Fox News strategic analyst, our friend General Jack Keane is with us. General, great to have you. If we were to be very blunt and very, very honest, General, the easier path for the president would be to wipe them out, obliterate them, hit all those targets. But the reality is the president really deep down does not want to do that to the Iranian people. I applaud him for that. And he's going the extra mile. However, when there's a report out tonight, the Iranian parliamentary speaker saying that they have new cards to play against the U.S. You have Iran's new IRGC chief, one of the hardliners from days gone by, now in charge of the guns. I'm less optimistic than I was over the weekend.
Yeah, sure. Well, you have cause to be, Sean, to be frank. I think what we're witnessing right before our eyes is a power struggle inside of Iran. And yes, Ghalibaf, while he was a general in the IRGC at one point, right along with Vahidi, who is now the head general in the IRGC, Ghalibaf does represent the political side of it because he's the head speaker in the parliament. And I think they are really at odds. We have talked to Ghalibaf in the past, and so we know for a fact that he is willing to make some compromises on the deal. In other words, some concessions to the United States. It's likely, we don't know for a fact, but Vahidi disagrees with all of that. And this power struggle is going on, and what will be the resolution of it? There's a couple of paths here. One, take President Trump serious, that if you don't come to the negotiating table and the ceasefire ends, by the way, it's Wednesday, not Tuesday it ends, and if it ends on Wednesday and he promises to go back to full combat operations. But so our audience understands, we have twice the capability on the U.S. side in the theater now than when we started the war. We have never given up bringing in additional assets to assist with the execution of our wartime objectives. The Israelis, who had some ammunition shortages, have full magazine depth now. So if we go back to combat operations, they are going to be absolutely full throttle and considerably more dramatic than anything the Iranians have experienced, to include all the targets the president is talking about and then some. But Vahidi, listen, hardliners here. Vahidi has a couple of choices here. One, okay, work it out with Ghalibaf and let's not test the president. Let's go to the negotiations, but put some strict controls on Ghalibaf in those negotiations. Or, and they're capable of this, Sean, test the president and accept going back to combat operations, because in the end, where they are, they believe that the president will not go completely to the end of it. The pressure on him politically and economically will force him to end it prematurely, and they'll still be standing, and they'll have leverage as a result of it. And no negotiations taking place at all is what he is possibly thinking. And I'm trying to put my head inside a bona fide hardliner who was the guy that was in charge of the Quds Force, and guess who he gave that job over to? Qasem Soleimani. So this is the ilk of what we're dealing with here. I just wanted our viewers to understand some of the thought processes that may be going on here, and even the extreme that I'm mentioning, and why wouldn't they accept what's plausible and also reasonable. Well, because this is the Iranians. And we got long time history with how unreasonable they absolutely are. And they don't care about their people. They care about what? Personal survival, the regime surviving. That is it. And they don't care about what's best for their people. And if we're going to pound Iran, and we would, to seriously force an economic collapse, that's what would be on the horizon. It would be less about their weapons and more about their future, for sure, here in terms of their viability economically. In Vahedi's mind, if he survives that, he wins. Now, that is diabolical thinking for sure, but that is part of the rationale. We have been dealing with these people for a long time, Sean.
After 14 bunker buster bombs, that war ended in 12 days. That was phase one, Midnight Hammer. I'm trying to understand, after all that President Trump has done here and all the damage he has inflicted upon them, how they could doubt in any way, shape, manner, or form his resolve to do it the hard way if he has to. And I want your reaction to that. And what about this warning about we have new cards to play? I take that as typical, quintessential propaganda and bluster. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, we know our president, and you would think the Iranians by now would know him as well. He has a tendency to follow through here. And that's the reality of it. So he's promising something that be much more significant and dramatic impact on them than what we have been doing to date. And I think he will absolutely deliver on that. He's also making a point, and certainly we understand this, that in our negotiations, while he's willing to talk, he's not going to put up with a bad deal. That is a fact. Because he understands and knows what a bad deal looked like. He walked away from one, as we all know, in 2018, 3 years into Obama's bad deal. So are they making assessments of the president? Of course they are. But they also, I think, where Vahedi's coming from, he believes there's significant pressure on the president. And it may be worth his while to try to accept whatever the president wants to give him. I think that is absolutely reckless thinking. And he's not being rational, but I'm just trying to paint a picture here of what can be going on. Hopefully, the best answer for the Iranians would be is whatever this debate is about, resolve it and get some negotiators in to sit down at the table with our negotiators and see if something can be worked out here. And certainly the United States has huge leverage here. The fact we can't dismiss the major leverage we have. In the first negotiations, we had the threat of going back to combat operations for sure. In the second negotiations, which we're about to take, the number one leverage we have is we have shut down all of Iranian exports, oil and everything else they export. And the reality of that is that's 80% of their revenue. That is huge leverage in of itself. The second piece of leverage we have, Sean, is what I mentioned. Full throttle combat operations. So we are going into these negotiations holding a lot of cards in our hands, and actually a stronger hand than we had in the last negotiations. President Trump knows that. Our negotiators know that. Ghalibaf certainly understands that. I think Vahedi probably understands it as well, the head of the IRGC. It remains to be seen what his reaction is going to be to all of this. I think we'll know within 12 to 20 hours for sure.
One thing I would love to see, the Israelis, somehow arms get in the hands of the people. Vahedi and others I don't think would survive. 180% inflation rate. Their currency is now worthless, on top of the fact that they have half their workforce not working. This will be devastating. Hopefully the Iranian people will then wake up. That becomes their moment of truth, too. General, as always, we appreciate you being with us. We appreciate your insight, sir. Thank you.
By the end of this interview, the real story is no longer just about one military assessment or one political warning. It becomes a larger portrait of what happens when a state under pressure begins to harden from within. General Keane is not describing a calm aftermath. He is describing a transition, one where the internal balance inside Iran appears to be moving toward the most uncompromising elements of the regime. And that matters, because when hardline power consolidates, every signal changes. Diplomacy sounds different, threats become more credible, and even silence can become a warning sign. What makes this moment so compelling is that it forces the viewer to look beyond headlines and ask a deeper question. When a regime is cornered, does it retreat or does it become more dangerous? Keane's argument suggests that this is exactly the risk now hanging over the region. The people gaining influence are not the ones looking for moderation, de-escalation, or a graceful exit. They are the ones most willing to turn pressure into confrontation, ideology into action, and instability into a weapon. That is why the phrase full throttle lands with so much weight here. It is not just a dramatic line. It is a warning that if the current path continues, the next stage may move faster, hit harder, and become much more difficult to contain. At the same time, the interview builds its tension by contrasting that danger with the leverage Keane says the United States still holds. He points to economic pressure, especially Iran's dependence on oil revenue, as a critical point of control. In his framing, the regime may project defiance, but underneath that defiance lies vulnerability. And that is where the strategic drama of this clip really lives. Between a government that wants to appear unbreakable and the reality that its survival still depends on resources, trade, and pressure points that powerful rivals can target. That tension between ideological confidence and material weakness is what gives the story its documentary force, because it reminds us that wars and standoffs are not shaped only by speeches and missiles, but by money, energy, internal power struggles, and the psychology of leaders who believe they cannot afford to look weak. But there is another layer here that makes the narrative even more gripping. Keane's warning is not only about governments, weapons, or bargaining positions. It is also about what happens to ordinary people trapped beneath these high-level decisions. Whenever hardline factions gain control, it is civilians who live with the consequences first. They are the ones who face economic collapse, fear, uncertainty, and the possibility that leaders fighting for strategic survival may sacrifice public stability in the process. And that is what gives this video an emotional undertone beneath all the military and geopolitical language. Because behind every phrase like leverage, escalation, retaliation, or pressure campaign, there are millions of lives hanging in the balance. Families, workers, young people, citizens living inside a system where they do not control the decisions, but will bear the cost of them. That is why this video works so well as a high-retention documentary narrative. It begins with analysis, but it ends with stakes. It starts as a strategy, but slowly becomes a story about power, fear, and the terrifying unpredictability of what comes next. In that sense, the most chilling part of this interview is not the certainty. It is the uncertainty. It is the idea that the world may be entering a phase where all sides understand the risks, and yet events may still keep moving toward confrontation. Keane is essentially warning that the machinery is still turning, the factions are still shifting, and the next move may come from people who see escalation not as failure, but as necessity. And that is why this moment should hold the audience all the way to the end. Because it does not feel finished. It feels like a prelude, a map of the pressure before the next shock, a snapshot of a region and a regime standing on the edge of a more dangerous chapter. So the final takeaway is simple, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. This is not just a conversation about Iran's future. It is a warning about how quickly a crisis can evolve when radical power tightens its grip, when pressure meets pride, and when the people making the decisions begin to believe they have nothing left to lose. And if that is where this story is headed, then what we are watching now is not the resolution. It is the moment before the acceleration. If you want to understand what full throttle conflict really looks like, you have to pay attention before it begins. And this video may be showing exactly that moment.